Do you think that altruistic tendencies stem more from being very loved and supported by a good family environment, or as a child, or religious values and beliefs? And this is a very interesting question. And that's because I think that you're kind of limiting yourself a bit with this, because I don't think that you necessarily have to limit it to just these two things. Is it, people who come from a good background? Is it people who are religious? And I think that we have to consider here that there may be more than one answer. Okay, so let's start out first by talking about what altruism is and what prosocial behavior is. And I want to make this distinction because I think it's important for us to make sure that we understand what both of things are. So prosocial behavior is what we refer to as an umbrella term. Okay, and I'm going to put that here. So prosocial behavior is what we refer to as it's an umbrella term, meaning that it is really broad and it has types of prosocial behaviors underneath it. Okay, so a prosocial behavior is any kind of helping behavior. Okay, so any kind of helping behavior. And it doesn't matter if you're doing it for your benefit or for their benefit or for both. Okay, so you might say, well, I'm going to donate money to a charity, and I'm doing it so that I can get the tax write-off, or I'm going to do X and I just want to do it for myself. Okay, or I don't have a reason, or I'm just helping because helping is smart, important, whatever. That's prosocial behavior, any kind of helping behavior. Okay, now a type of prosocial behavior, so underneath prosocial behavior, we have something called altruism, right? Altruism is helping someone or something, an animal, a person, whatever. It's helping without any expectation of reward, and might actually put you in harm's way if you do this thing. So let's say you see a burning building and you have no investment in this building or anybody in it. You don't know anybody. It's a burning building. And then suddenly you see that there are kitties in the building and you go, oh, I need to rescue these kittens. And you run in and you get the kittens, and you're not doing it for a thank you. You're not doing it because, you want to sell the kittens later. There's no, and you're even potentially putting yourself in danger. The building could collapse. You could die. You could get hurt by going and rescuing those kittens, or a person, or it doesn't matter, whatever. That's a very altruistic act. Okay, it's one that you're getting no benefit from it. You're doing it because you think that somebody needs to do it, and those kittens need to be rescued. Okay, so altruism fits under prosocial behavior, but it's something that is done without any reward on your part, or nobody's, patting you on the back. You're not doing it to post to Facebook to get somebody to like or heart your post. You know what I mean? So altruism is a very specific type of prosocial behavior. Now, there is actually quite a debate about altruism, and some scientists would argue that altruism actually does not exist. And that's because any kind of benefit, even one that makes you feel good, would null and void altruism. So if you are helping and you don't tell anybody, like the Secret Santas will go around and they'll pay off layaways or they'll pay off school lunches, and they do it anonymously, that reads altruistic behavior, right? Because you're anonymous, you're helping someone, you're not getting it for an external reward. Some scientists would argue that if it makes you feel good and you're doing it because it makes you feel good as a person, as it's a positive thing. Some scientists would argue that that's not actually altruism because you're doing it for that good feeling. Now, I would argue that that's splitting hairs. And I would say a true altruistic act would be Yeah, you might feel good doing it. Yeah, that might be kind of the reason why you do it. But, you're not doing it for somebody to pat you on the back. You're not doing it to get a reward. You're not doing it to get any kind of money or anything. So I would argue that that would be an altruistic act. Now, your question about what makes a person more likely to be altruistic. So there's a couple of things here. So first of all, you asked about religion, and religion has been there's a lot of very contradictory work out there. So there's been a line of studies that suggest that people who are religious are more likely to engage in prosocial behavior. Now, note I said prosocial behavior, not altruistic behavior. People who are religious, or at least surrounded by religious people, so not necessarily religious themselves, but in a community that's highly religious, we find that those people tend to do more prosocial behaviors. It doesn't necessarily mean in some lines of research that they're going to be more altruistic, but that they're more likely to give, they're more likely to help, and they tend to be more generous. Okay. Now, there is a whole line of research that completely argues that that doesn't exist. There's actually some studies that say that atheists are more likely to be altruistic or engage in prosocial behaviors than people who are religious. But some of that work, there's some problems with some of the details and limitations in actual studies. There was a recent study that came out that said children who are religious are less likely to share, and they're actually meaner than children who aren't religious, although there were a lot of problems with that study, and they used stickers and things like that to share, and it didn't seem to be super well conducted research. So it's kind of up in the air. Now, I would argue about the definition of altruism with a person who is highly religious. So if the person is doing a kind act because they feel it's going to get them into heaven, is that altruism? And I don't have a good answer for that. And that's kind of like, what is your opinion on that? Do you feel like if a person says, well, I want to be a good person, I want to be a kind person, I want good in the world, but I also really want to go to heaven, and I feel like if I do a bunch of kind acts, it's going to get me to heaven, that might not necessarily be true altruism, because you're doing it for a later reward. Now, in that case, it would absolutely be prosocial behavior, because it doesn't matter if you're getting an actual anything out of it. So there's that. Okay. So I know I'm not completely answering your question, but I don't think that there is an actual yes or no answer, because so much of the research is kind of spread on it, and the definition of altruism is not concrete. Okay. Now, we do have some evidence as to why there's some reasons why some people tend to be more altruistic than others. One of them is there is a personality trait that is argued to be kind of the altruistic, more of an altruistic personality trait. Although people who seem to have this trait don't tend to be more likely to be altruistic. So it's an odd, when it's studied, when this particular personality trait of like kindness, generosity, they kind of put it into sort of an altruistic trait. It turns out that there isn't a huge correlation into you being more likely to actually engage in altruistic acts. So that's kind of a weird thing. And I would say that, yeah, there's a possibility that someone might have personality traits that kind of lean them in a certain direction, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to engage in those kinds of acts. There have been quite a few studies, and there's a really good TED Talk about the brain differences. So if you Google what makes a person more altruistic, there's a really good TED Talk out there by a specialist, she's a psychologist, who studies brain differences and some other differences between psychopaths and altruistic people, and find some really interesting changes or differences in the brain and behaviors and in terms of empathy. And one area of your brain that's really important for empathy and generosity, and or not less about generosity, more about feeling empathetic toward people, feeling emotion, being able to read people's emotions. There's a particular area in the brain called the amygdala that's really important for that. And they found in a lot of studies that people who are more altruistic also tend to have a bigger amygdala. And people who are less altruistic and less likely to be empathetic, um, less likely to be able to read emotion well, more likely to be psychopathic, um, actually have smaller amygdalas. So there's actually brain differences in this case. So, the argument is if you're more empathetic, you're more likely to give and be generous and be kind because you really understand what the person's going through. Sympathy is feeling sorry for someone, right? Empathy is really understanding what they're going through and feeling it on a more emotional level. So the question is it genetic or is it environmental? Well, in cases like brain differences, how your body and anatomy is made up is a very much genetic and hereditary, but also can be influenced by your environment, influenced by your caregivers and modeling behaviors. So I would say that just like everything else, this kind of behavior is both genetic, physiological, psychological, and environmental. And it just depends on what kind of environment you're in, what kind of role models you have. If you have parents who are, very generous, very empathetic, it could be to their genetic makeup, it could be to their brain anatomy, and then they might have passed that along to you, and then also brought you up in an environment where you see this behavior modeled, that your parents are more likely to give or help or volunteer or go and do kind things for people. Then you will probably be more likely to be that way. You're not guaranteed to, though. And there are people who are brought up in environments that are really abusive or neglectful, never see any kind of prosocial or altruistic behaviors, and those people can be extremely kind and extremely generous because they're more empathetic, because they know what it's like to not experience, kindness. They may actually be more likely to engage in kindness. So it very much dependent on a lot of different factors. But that is certainly something that is an interesting line of research that is not definite. There's a lot of very contradictory things about what makes somebody more altruistic. So like I said, I know I didn't exactly answer your question with yes or no, or this versus that, but hopefully it gave you enough information so that you can see that the answers are still kind of blurry. But there are a lot of factors at play here that could, change the game, so to speak, in this kind of particular trait that we see in people. So if you have any questions, you know to email me. That was the only question that we had for today. So I'm going to go ahead and end early. And if you have any additional questions or follow-up questions, please feel free to email me. And I will see you next time. So have a great rest of your week.